alarm bells ringing. Officially, NATO chose to believe there'd been misunderstandings and announced that Russian and American ministers would meet next week to smooth them out. But it was harder to explain away President Yeltsin's tough words on television, warning America not to send ground troops to Yugoslavia and provoke possible Russian intervention. Don't push us towards military actions, he said. Otherwise there will be a European war for sure, or even a world war. The United States says it's been assured that Russian missiles have not been aimed at NATO targets. That suggestion came from the Speaker of the Russian Parliament and was later denied. It's assumed this is all part of Russia's internal political battles and an indication of how dangerous instability in Moscow can be.
There is nothing...
Overnight, NATO had also struck at another major oil depot. Serb television showed an enormous conflagration. NATO says oil shortages are starting to strangle the Serb military machine. But there is no indication that Serb forces are withdrawing from Kosovo. Instead, NATO says they are digging in to resist attack. Brian Hanrahan, BBC News.
The world's most powerful military force is on the move, but only on the training ground. US Marines know how to fight in tough conditions. They have recent experience from Vietnam to Somalia, but there's no suggestion they're heading for Kosovo, at least not yet.
It's a very tough thing to see things going on and know that Americans are involved with that and not be there, not be a part of it. We want to do our part to carry out America's foreign policies.
Dan Milosevic.
He hopes that we will accept as permanent the results of his ethnic cleansing. We will not.
In the end, it's a simple question. Is America ready to pay a high price to spill its soldiers' blood to secure victory in Kosovo and defend its credibility? The president still seems hesitant, but he knows an answer will have to come soon. Stephen Sacker, BBC News, Quantico Marine Base, Virginia.
Dive.
In the Adriatic, the US Navy prepares another cruise missile attack on Serbia. Airstrikes are NATO's one means of exerting pressure on Slobodan Milosevic, yet even in this third week of the campaign, it's not clear if they're working. The Air Force videos released every day do show the weapons reaching their targets, but the extent of the damage they cause is not always known. The bad weather, which so often prevents the bombing, also prevents reconnaissance, and facts are hard to come by. The daily briefings at NATO headquarters usually say everything is going according to plan. Today, though, the military spokesman admitted the bombing still had much to achieve.
I'm very confident that we are moving very firmly in the right direction. But as far as your question is, we certainly haven't hit a big enough percentage of his forces yet.
The positive view here at NATO headquarters is that Serb forces are being steadily broken by the bombing, that the refugee crisis has served to galvanize the alliance here, and that in the end Mr. Milosevic simply cannot win. A less optimistic view is that the bombing has so far failed to stop the harassment of the Kosovo Albanians and has not in any sense yet brought Mr. Milosevic to heel. NATO's response is to build up forces while it tries to work out what to do next. Albania is becoming the base for 24 Apache helicopter gunships. They should be highly effective against Serb units in Kosovo, as will the multiple launch rocket systems being deployed there as well. Kosovo falls well within their 100-mile range. The 8,000 NATO soldiers being sent to Albania are meant to help the refugees, and the 12,000 in Macedonia now are ready to police a peace deal if one comes. But in case there is no peace agreement, other scenarios are opening up. NATO forces could enter the province if bombing makes it safe enough and set up a protectorate to help the refugees return. Or Mr. Milosevic could try to partition Kosovo, keeping the more prosperous areas, including the capital, Pristina, and the battlefield site of Kosovo Polje, so sacred to Serbs. That wouldn't be a complete victory for him, but it wouldn't be for NATO either. The new forces are on their way, but how they'll end up being used and how they'll affect the future of Kosovo are questions that NATO can't really answer tonight. David Shukman, BBC News.
From the Pentagon.
Precision-guided weapons have already hit 150 different targets, and the U.S. is getting ready to send dozens more aircraft. But bad weather is moving in and likely to slow the airstrikes in the coming days. Last night, for instance, B-2 stealth bombers were the only planes able to drop their bombs. The slowdown comes as reliable but unconfirmed reports of what is happening in Kosovo become more horrifying with each passing day.
Young Kosovar women are being herded into a Serb army training camp where they are being raped by troops, and we have reports that as many as 20 may have been killed.
As desperate as these refugees are, they at least have escaped from Kosovo into the arms of a rapidly expanding relief effort. There is no relief for tens of thousands still trapped in Kosovo.
We believe that there may be about 150 to 200,000 people in Kosovo currently living without shelter in the woods and on the mountain slopes.
Unless Milosevic reverses course and pulls his army out of Kosovo, there is no prospect of getting aid to them anytime soon. But the Serb army is not pulling out, it is digging in.
We're up against a wily enemy. He's beginning to dig in. There are terrain, forests, deserted villages, which make wonderful places for him to lager up against.
Satellites. Background, CBS's Eric Ingberg shows you the war in the Balkans, the way it's pumped out on Milosevic government-controlled Serb TV.
These are the television images most of the world saw of the tragic story of Kosovo's refugees.
A human train crossed the border from Kosovo today.
TV viewers inside Yugoslavia that same day saw a far different story. Tranquil border, just a few refugees, worried only about NATO bombs. NATO's hopes of turning dictator Milosevic's people against him by showing the evil of his policies has been blunted by Milosevic's absolute control over the media. It reports no Serb atrocities and portrays the NATO forces as modern-day Nazis.
The children of Yugoslavia who are daily being affected by NATO criminal sadistic airstrikes.
The inability to marshal the truth against Milosevic at home has frustrated NATO so much it briefly threatened to bomb Yugoslavian TV transmitters before backing down today. As in all wars, both sides have withheld and twisted some facts. Yugoslavia claimed civilian targets had been hit in Pristina.
Bombs fell on the center of this city, killing Serbs, Albanians, Turks.
NATO first denied it, then had to backtrack when Western reporters were taken to the scene. But Milosevic's propaganda goes far beyond typical government spin. There's something for the young, daily patriotic rock concerts, and music videos which transform a Nazi soldier into the U.S. Secretary of State. The biggest of the big lies, news stories showing busy highways and claiming that Kosovar Albanians are actually heading home on them. Losing the TV war where it counts, NATO has made a demand unique in the history of warfare: equal time on Serb TV. Milosevic's propagandists have said no. Eric Engberg, CBS News, Washington.
Arrives to meet the Macedonian leadership. Diplomats hope a combination of U.S. political pressure and financial assistance will soften Macedonia's stance on providing a more permanent home for the Kosovars already here.
We are not going to lose to the likes of Slobodan Milosevic, and so be on our team, and they got that point. So, things are better this week than they were last week, but we are not out of the woods yet.
Additional warplanes to attack Yugoslav targets, including F-16 CJs and the Prowler electronic warfare planes, specifically designed to attack air defenses and ground targets. Though he's asking for more planes, General Clark said the air campaign has already succeeded in forcing many Serb units to take cover.
They are simply not operating. They're in hiding. They've pulled into wood lines, they're hiding in buildings, and they're doing other things to try to escape the threat of NATO air.
Despite worsening weather, NATO launched about 200 sorties in the last 24 hours, officials say, hitting 5 target areas. The spokesman said there is now worrying evidence of another type of war crime.
We're getting some very disturbing reports out of Kosovo recently that young Kosovar women are being herded into a Serb army training camp near the town of Dakovica, which is in southwest Kosovo, where they are being raped by troops, and we have reports that as many as 20 may have been killed.
At the State Department, they put faces to the names of 6 commanders of units now suspected of war crimes. NATO aircraft continued to go after targets like this bridge over the Danube, trying to cut off supply lines to the forces in Kosovo. As for the Apache ground attack helicopters, they will not take to the skies over Kosovo for at least a week, probably longer. The Apaches could not be used sooner anyway, officials say, because Serb air defenses are still too strong.
I don't believe General Clark yet thinks the situation is right for using helicopters over.
The U.S. would have been embarrassed by pictures like these. A U.S. military spy plane downed over Kosovo, taking pictures over enemy territory. This plane and others like it, flown by Germany, had no pilot, a drone equipped with cameras and other sensing devices.
So if you look to the east.
But in this war, the Allies proudly show off their intelligence pictures for a political purpose, to make the case for the NATO bombing of a sovereign nation.
After NATO bombings of certain sites, the Serbs very cravenly go in and destroy civilian buildings around those targets to try to create a misimpression that NATO bombings have destroyed civilian targets.
The United States, Germany, and its allies are using once hush-hush intelligence to make the case of ethnic cleansing against the Serbs, to bolster pictures from the ground showing the extent of the humanitarian nightmare in southeastern Europe. Washington is also showing off other sources of information inside Kosovo. U.S. Secretary of State Madeleine Albright has remained in telephone contact with this man, Hashim Thaçi, a KLA leader who cooperated with U.S. negotiating efforts before NATO began bombing. Thaçi, now back inside Kosovo, regularly telephones Albright's office, usually speaking with a close aide.
I spoke to him yesterday. I think I spoke to him several times in the last week. He has tended to try to give me a situation report as best as he can assess of what's going on.
State Department officials tell CNN they consider the KLA to be a passionate but unreliable source of information.
Intelligence. He's got the latest on that angle for us this morning. Aram?
Leon, officials here say once again the airstrikes, the latest wave at least, were limited by bad weather over the Balkans. Officials indicate a number of planes flew and then returned to their bases or to their ships without dropping their ordnance on their targets. British officials say the attacks were against the Serb fuel supply and command and control facilities. We understand that cruise missiles were used in the attacks. Serbian television reports that Serbian television facilities in Pristina were attacked and that a transmitter was struck. A NATO official tells us that the television station in Pristina was not the target. That official tells us that a military radio station was the target. British officials...
Roosevelt this week, warplanes taking off in the dead of night, destined for the combat zone on a mission to hit Yugoslav targets. But there is another side, one that we usually do not get to see, the enormous carrier crew behind the mission. CNN's Bill Delaney is on board the Roosevelt.
A third day of launches from the USS Theodore Roosevelt in the North Ionian Sea in support of NATO's conflict with Yugoslavia. The power of fighter bombers, F-18s, F-14s, now attacking bridges, air defense radars, police headquarters, fuel depots. Catapulting in 2 seconds from 0 to 150 miles an hour. Only one level, though, of the labyrinth that is the Roosevelt.
He was sitting there. He was the first go.
When the night's missions end, for example, the carrier's 70 aircraft become part of a picture puzzle.
Still sitting there.
Organizing which aircraft need special maintenance, which don't.
Just a lot of people getting tired now. You got to watch what you're really doing. Working hours have changed a lot. Usually I work nights, and as you can see, I'm working days now because everything seems to be happening at night.
On every level of the Roosevelt, a new intensity.
Above all the activity of the flight deck and below it, here on the bridge is still another world of the USS Roosevelt,
as hushed and almost soothing as most everywhere else is loud, nerve-wracking. Tranquil and where the ship is steered. Fundamental for high-performance jets on carriers, which must fly directly into the wind off the bow. For hours, Lieutenant David Riley just watches the wind.
I'm just trying to make sure that we head in the right direction.
Basic stuff mingling with pure power on the Roosevelt's many levels. Bill Delaney, CNN, on board the USS Theodore Roosevelt.
Successful attack of the radio relay facility. One Serbian aircraft was detected off the coast of Montenegro, but it returned to base before it could be engaged. At least 4, some 6 sites engaged NATO aircraft with no harm on them. And we also discussed yesterday the challenge of proving what damage has been caused by Serb forces. You might recall this. And I have an image for you. It shows damaged buildings in a village which have not been the subject of any NATO action. Right. Where is it? I'm sorry, I missed one page. May I? I come to the map here, and the rest you will hear a bit later. The very noticeable reduction in Yugoslav army and special police force operations in Kosovo have continued over the last 24 hours. There were some Serb activities in the southern half of Kosovo, with fires burning near Podujevo and Đakovica, and other activity near Urozovac, Malisevo, Kishna Reka, and Jablanica areas. Overall, the Yugoslav forces appear to be focusing on defensive and force protection measures against NATO attacks. There was one cross-border clash between VJMAP and UCK elements over the Albanian border southwest of Dikane. At least 2 Serb artillery rounds landed in Albania. The result of previous attacks on the army barracks at Prison are shown by these pre- and post-strike images. Here's the pre-strike, and here the post-strike. A similar attack was effectively done at the army garrison and headquarters at Belgrade. Again, the pre-strike and the post-strike. Moving on to the location of ground forces, this picture shows a number of tanks and armored personnel carriers hiding amongst houses in a village. We discussed yesterday the challenge of proving, and this really shows to you and it demonstrates the difficulty of attacking such targets. We are seeking to clarify refugee reports of a possible Serb rape camp in the Đakovica area of Kosovo. No independent corroboration or detailed confirmation is currently available. And at this moment, if I may, I would like to come back to yesterday's discussion of the difficulties of tracking displaced persons within Kosovo. We have a map which shows some areas where concentrations of displaced persons have been identified. And I have a photograph. On this image, you can see a line of vehicles, but what we cannot tell you is how many people are associated with them. And this image shows concentrations of displaced persons without shelters, but numbers, again, are difficult to assess. Yesterday, we also discussed the challenge of proving what damage has been caused by Serb forces. I think it was in the context of the Pristina